Somebody screamed sold before the auctioneer even finished the word, because the number on that final bid didn't make sense. Not from a man who raised it. Quiet guy, plain jacket, sitting in the back row like he didn't belong in a room full of suits. 20 minutes earlier, 3 people in that room had laughed when he walked in. Now, those same 3 people were staring at him like he'd grown a second head. He just bought Holt Brothers Lumber, the factory that spent 20 years treating his backyard like a dumping ground. And nobody in that room, except for one old man near the front, understood exactly how long this moment had been coming. Let's go back, because this story doesn't start in an auction hall. It starts in a hospital hallway with an 8-year-old boy who didn't understand why his father wasn't breathing anymore. Elijah Carter's father dropped dead of a heart attack on a Wednesday morning, halfway through breakfast. No warning, no would-be, just a fork hitting the floor and a silence that never really left that family again. His father had been a quiet man, a machinist, the kind of man who fixed things around the neighborhood for free just because he liked the sound of a job done right. Elijah remembers him teaching him to hammer a nail straight the summer before he died. Don't rush the wood, his father told him. Let it tell you where it wants to go. He didn't understand what that meant at the time. He would understand it completely years later, standing over a pile of scrap lumber nobody else wanted. His mother, Patricia, buried her husband on savings that ran out 3 weeks later. The insurance company found a reason to deny the claim. Something about a missed premium payment 2 months prior. She fought it for a while. Then she stopped fighting and started surviving. The cheapest place she could find for herself and her son sat on Miller Road, right against the fence line of an old lumber operation called Holt Brothers. She didn't think much of the fence when she signed the lease. She would think about nothing else within a month. Every weekday afternoon, right around 4 o'clock, dump trucks rolled up to that fence and unloaded broken pallets, splintered beams, sawdust so thick it settled on their windowsills like snow. Elijah remembers standing at his bedroom window the first time it happened, watching a mountain of wood scraps rise higher than the fence itself. By the time he started 3rd grade that fall, kids at school already had a nickname for him. Trash boy. Nobody wanted to sit near him at lunch. A few kids said his house smelled like garbage. Even though it didn't, it just smelled like sawdust and diesel exhaust. His mother went to the factory office more times than she could count. The manager, a broad-shouldered man named Frank Delaney, barely looked up from his desk most visits. You're renting cheap because the location's cheap, he told her once, not unkindly, just carelessly. People like you should be grateful to live anywhere at all. She left that office every time with her jaw clenched and her eyes wet. She never let Elijah see her cry. He saw anyway. But nobody in that office had any idea what they were about to build 1 truckload a day. One October afternoon, Elijah climbed the pile, looking for something to distract himself from another bad day at school. He found a wooden stool, missing 1 leg, tossed out along with everything else. He carried it home, set on the kitchen table, and just looked at it for a long time. What are you doing with that? His mother asked. I'm going to fix it, he said, like it was obvious. He had no tools, no training, no idea where to even start. But the public library was 6 blocks away, and library cards were free and nobody there. Called him Trash Boy. He checked out every book on woodworking the branch had, including 2 that hadn't been touched in over a decade based on the dust. He read by flashlight most nights because their electric bill didn't allow for much lamp time. 3 weeks later, that stool had 4 legs again. Uneven, wobbly, ugly by any real standard. His mother sat on it anyway, right there in the kitchen, and held his hand across the table, without saying a word. That was the night something shifted permanently inside that boy. Nobody else knew it yet, but it had already happened. The very next week, something happened that almost ended it all before it began. Elijah was digging through the scrap pile after school, looking for usable boards, when a jagged splinter the size of a nail drove straight through his palm. Blood soaked through his shirt sleeve by the time he got home. Patricia rushed him to the emergency room, and the doctor asked how exactly an 8-year-old boy ended up with a 2-inch shard of wood embedded in his hand. He was playing in a scrap pile, she told the doctor. too embarrassed to say dump. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with his hand bandaged thick as a boxing glove, Elijah made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't going to stop. He was just going to get smarter about it. He started wearing his father's old work gloves, 3 sizes too big, folded over at the fingertips. He learned to sort wood by weight and grain instead of just grabbing whatever looked interesting. He turned a dangerous hobby into a discipline. By 10 years old, Elijah wasn't just repairing things anymore. He was building a small shelf for his mother's spice jars, a jewelry box with a hand-carved lid, a little rocking horse for a neighbor's toddler, made almost entirely from factory offcuts. Every piece traced back to the same source. With that Holt Brothers lumber considered garbage, delivered fresh to his fence line every single afternoon. While the rest of the world saw waste, Elijah saw an endless supply chain nobody else wanted to claim. The mocking didn't stop, though. Kids still crossed the street rather than walk past his house. Teachers noticed splinters on his hands sometimes and never once asked why. One afternoon, a boy named Curtis, the loudest of the kids who mocked him, followed Elijah home just to see the dump house for himself. Standing at the fence, Curtis expected a laugh. Instead, he saw a boy his own age with a hand-carved bird sitting on a workbench, wings so detailed you could count the feathers. Curtis didn't say anything mean that day. He just stood there a while, then walked home. Quiet. Small moments like that started happening more, though nobody talked about them out loud. At 12, he worked up the courage to sell something for the first time. A small side table, sanded smooth despite the mismatched wood grain. He knocked on 6 doors in the neighborhood before someone finally answered without shutting it in his face. An elderly woman named Miss Odetta, 2 streets over, examined that table for a long, quiet moment. "How much you asking?" she said. $10, Elijah answered, barely above a whisper. She handed him 20. "Don't you ever undersell your own hands again," she told him. "Not for anybody." He carried that money home like it was made of gold. Miss Odetta became his first real customer, and then something closer to a grandmother. She'd call him over some Saturdays just to fix a squeaky drawer or a loose chair leg, always paying him more than he asked, always reminding him of his own worth like it was a lesson that needed repeating. But $20 wasn't going to change a family's fortune. What happened over the next 15 years would. The dumping never slowed down. If anything, Holt Brothers expanded operations as the years passed, and the trucks came more often, not less. Patricia kept complaining. County offices, environmental hotlines, local news tip lines that never called back. One inspector told her flatly, "It's zoned industrial next door. Nothing illegal about dumping. Approved waste on their own property." She hung up that phone and sat in silence for a long time. But down the hall, Elijah wasn't sulking. He was sketching his next project on the back of a school worksheet, because he had already figured out something the adults around him hadn't. Every truckload of garbage was a truckload of opportunity, and nobody else was claiming it. At 15, a woodshop teacher named Mr. Alvarez caught him sketching detailed cabinet joints during study hall. "Where did you learn dovetail joinery?" Alvarez asked, genuinely stunned. "Library books," Elijah said, "and a lot of wasted wood before I got it right." Alvarez started staying after school twice a week, teaching him techniques no library book could fully explain. For the first time since his father's death, an adult outside his home looked at Elijah and saw potential instead of pity. That same year, the school held a talent showcase, and Elijah entered a hand-built cabinet. Into the craftsmanship category, the only student who'd ever built something instead of performing something. A few classmates laughed when they saw his name on the entry list. Trash boys got a project. Somebody snickered near the gymnasium doors. He won first place anyway. The judges, all local business owners, didn't know his backstory. They just saw joinery that looked like it belonged in a furniture showroom, not a teenager's garage. One judge, a hardware store owner named Mr. Petrakis, offered him a small consignment shelf in his store that same week. It was the first time someone with a real storefront had ever said yes to him. But belief and one small shelf don't pay bills, and At 16, disaster struck again. Patricia lost her job at the packaging plant across town during a round of layoffs nobody saw coming. For nearly 4 months, the Carter household survived on almost nothing. Elijah sold every finished piece he owned, took odd jobs mowing lawns and hauling trash for neighbors who could spare a few dollars. One night, he found his mother crying quietly at the kitchen table, thinking he was already asleep. He sat down beside her instead. "I'm going to build something so big," he told her, "that nobody can ever look down on us." Again, she wiped her eyes and managed a tired smile. "I believe you, baby. I always have." Neither of them had any idea how long that road still was. But it had already begun the day he dragged that broken stool off the scrap pile. Senior year, a guidance counselor pulled Elijah aside after noticing his craftsmanship. Portfolio, insisting he apply for a design scholarship at university 2 states away. He got in. Full tuition. Housing covered. The kind of opportunity nobody from Miller Road was supposed to receive. Patricia cried happy tears for the first time in years when the acceptance letter arrived. But Elijah sat with that letter for almost a week before making a decision that surprised everyone around him. He turned it down. "If I leave now, everything I've built here falls apart," he told his mother, laying the letter flat on the kitchen table where that first stool once sat. "I can learn what I need to learn without leaving the one thing that's actually working." Patricia argued with him for 2 full nights, terrified he was giving up a real future for a backyard hobby. "This isn't a hobby anymore," he told her quietly. "This is the beginning of something. I can feel it." She didn't understand it then. She would understand it completely years later, standing beside a rusted fence line on land her son would come to own. At 18, fresh out of high school, Elijah bought a used pickup truck with money saved from years of odd jobs and small furniture sales. He used it to collect scrap wood from 3 additional lumber operations across town. Not just Holt Brothers. He converted an old shed behind their house into a real workshop, insulated it himself using foam scraps nobody else wanted, wired basic lighting with help from a retired electrician down the street who worked for nothing but coffee and conversation. His craftsmanship had started reaching beyond the neighborhood by then. A local event planner named Renata Osei discovered one of his reclaimed wood serving tables at a community fundraiser and asked around until she found out who made it. Some kid, someone told her, lives out by the old lumber yard. She tracked him down herself, examined his work with her hands, and said something that changed the trajectory of his entire life. "Do you understand what people in the city would pay for this?" He didn't. Not yet. Renata connected him to boutique furniture shops and small restaurant owners hungry for something with real character behind it. Orders started arriving faster than Elijah could fill them working alone. But growth came with its own kind of danger. At 21, a larger furniture manufacturer noticed his rising reputation and tried to buy him out entirely, offering a modest sum for the Carter reclaimed name and a permanent non-compete agreement. It would have meant a comfortable paycheck and the end of building anything of his own ever again. He turned it down without hesitation. The same executive, annoyed at the rejection, spread word through supplier circles that Elijah's operation was unlicensed and unreliable, hoping to scare away his growing client base. For nearly 2 months, new orders slowed to almost nothing. Elijah nearly lost the lease on his small downtown storefront that same year. He remembers sitting in his truck outside that empty shop, wondering if the whole thing was about to collapse before it ever really started. Then Renata called 3 of her contacts personally, vouching for his work, and orders started trickling back in. It was the closest he ever came to losing everything. He never forgot it. At 20, he hired his first employee, a laid-off carpenter twice his age who didn't care, whose name was on the paycheck as long as it cleared the bank. That same year, a smooth-talking businessman named Dale Whitfield approached Elijah outside his storefront, offering to become a financial partner in exchange for 30% ownership. Elijah was young, stretched thin, desperate for capital to buy proper equipment. He signed the papers without a lawyer reading them first. 6 months later, Dale started making decisions without him, cutting corners on material, quality, rushing orders out the door to boost short-term numbers, damaging the reputation. Elijah had spent years building one careful piece at a time. When Elijah confronted him, Dale laughed in his face. "I own 30% of this company," Dale said. "That means I get a say whether you like it or not." It took 8 months and nearly every dollar Elijah had saved to buy Dale out of the business, entirely at a price far higher than the capital had originally been worth. He walked away from that experience with one lesson burned permanently into him. Never again build something on a foundation he didn't fully control. He read every contract twice after that, sometimes 3 times, sometimes out loud, alone, in his workshop, just to make sure the words meant exactly what he thought they meant. At 23, he had a small storefront downtown and 6 employees on payroll. That same year, he applied for a small business loan to purchase proper industrial equipment, hoping to double his production capacity. The loan officer, a young man barely older than Elijah himself, looked over his application for a long moment before sliding it back across the desk. "Your revenue history looks solid," the man admitted, "but the committee's going to want to see more collateral than a leased storefront and a truck." Elijah walked out of that bank with nothing, drove straight to the old shed behind his mother's former house, still standing empty on Miller Road, and sat in his truck outside it for almost an hour. He thought about walking away from the whole thing more than once that year. Thought about taking a steady factory job somewhere, something with a guaranteed paycheck, and none of the uncertainty. Renata talked him out of it over coffee one evening, reminding him how far he'd already come from a broken, 3-legged stool. "Banks don't understand stories like yours," she told him. "They understand spreadsheets. So build the spreadsheet and make them understand." He spent the next 4 months documenting every order, every material cost, every customer relationship in painstaking detail, walking back into a different bank with a presentation instead of a plea. That second bank approved him. It was the first time Elijah understood that persistence wasn't just about outworking people. Sometimes it was about learning to speak a language the world respected without losing the one that actually built you. That same year, a fire broke out in the storage section of his workshop overnight, caused by an old space heater nobody remembered leaving on. Half a year's worth of finished inventory turned to ash before the fire department even arrived. Elijah stood outside at 4 in the morning, watching smoke curl into the sky, certain everything he'd built since he was 8 years old had just gone up with it. He didn't have insurance yet, couldn't afford it at the time. His mother stood beside him that night, both of them silent, watching years of work disappear into smoke. "We'll start again," she finally said. "We did it with one broken stool. We can do it again." Miss Odetta, hearing about the fire from a neighbor, showed up the next morning with a coffee can full of cash. Nearly $400, most of it in small bills, clearly saved over years. "I told you never to undersell yourself," she said, pressing into his hands. "Now don't you dare quit on yourself either." He rebuilt from nothing. Again, at 26, Carter Reclaimed Furniture was shipping custom orders to restaurants and boutique hotels across 4 states. Every single piece still traced back to the same origin story, when nobody else wanted. Meanwhile, across town, something else was quietly falling apart. Holt Brothers Lumber was drowning. New state regulations targeting improper industrial waste disposal hit them hard. Fees accumulated faster than management could pay them off. Frank Delaney, still running daily operations, had spent 2 decades treating community complaints like background static. Now, regulators weren't background noise anymore. Cleanup costs, legal settlements from 2 other neighboring families who'd finally taken action over decades of unauthorized dumping. Equipment breakdowns the company could no longer afford to fix. The factory that once treated an entire family's backyard like a landfill was buried under the weight of its own negligence. Elijah wasn't watching any of this happen out of spite. He genuinely had no idea how bad things had gotten. He was too busy building something real. By 28, Carter reclaimed had grown into a nationally recognized sustainable furniture brand. Magazine features a custom order waitlist stretching nearly a year long. Patricia finally retired from the cleaning job she'd taken years earlier just to help make ends meet. Elijah bought her a proper house across town. No fins, no trucks rattling the windows. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, she cried the day she got the keys in her hand. "You did this," she whispered. "We did this," he corrected her gently. He kept one thing from the old house, though. That very first stool, 3 legs turned 4, still wobbly after all these years. It sat in the corner of his office at the new workshop, never sold, never touched by a customer's hand. But the story wasn't finished, because across town, in a tense boardroom full of men who'd run out of options, Holt Brothers Lumber was about to make an announcement that would change everything. The company was going under completely. Debt had stacked past any point of recovery. Regulatory fees, legal settlements, machinery, failures nobody had budgeted to repair. The bank forced a decision nobody in that room wanted to face. Full liquidation, public auction, land, buildings, equipment, and the company name itself, all going to the highest bidder. Frank Delaney, now in his 60s and nowhere near as imposing as the man who once dismissed a grieving widow from his office doorway, sat through that meeting without saying a word. He'd built nothing to fall back on. No community goodwill. No loyalty earned from people. He'd spent decades treating like they didn't matter. Just dead, and a for sale sign about to go up on land his family had operated for 3 generations. News of the auction spread through the local business community fast. Prime industrial land. Existing infrastructure already in place. A rare chance to build. Something new on ground with decades of history. Investors started circling. Developers made calls. Everyone assumed some outside corporation would swoop in and strip it for parts. Nobody expected who actually walked through those doors on auction day. Elijah sat parked outside that same rusted chain-link fence for almost 10 full minutes before he could make himself walk inside. The exact fence line where trucks once buried his childhood backyard under mountains of scrap wood. He wasn't there for revenge. He repeated that to himself the entire drive over. He was there because that patch of land, more than anywhere else on earth, had built him. From nothing. Every splinter, every rejected board, every hard lesson in patience and grit and turning garbage into something worth keeping. It made him, and now it needed somebody to save it. Inside the auction hall, nobody recognized him walking in. Just a quiet man in a plain jacket, sitting near the back, watching the numbers climb. 2 development firms drove the bidding up fast, planning to bulldoze the entire site and put up warehouses. Elijah raised his paddle for the first time, and the room went noticeably quieter. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Wait a second, is that Carter?" Carter reclaimed. Someone in the front row spun fully around in their seat to look. Frank Delaney, seated near the auctioneer's table purely as a formality, slowly turned his head too. Recognition crossed his face in stages. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. The bidding kept climbing. Back and forth, aggressive and fast, the development firms, unwilling to lose prime land to what they assumed was some small local hobbyist. At one point, the lead developer turned around in his seat and scoffed loud enough for half the room to hear. "This is a furniture maker. Let the professionals handle real estate." A few people near him laughed. Elijah didn't respond right away. He simply looked down at the paddle in his hand, thought of a coffee can full of small bills, a burned-out workshop at 4 in the morning, a bank officer sliding his application back across a desk. Thought of a widow standing in a factory office doorway, told to be grateful for anything at all. He looked back up and raised his paddle again, higher this time, steady. The auctioneer called a new number. The developer's associate leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear. The developer waved a hand, dismissing it, and raised his own paddle in response. Back and forth it went for nearly 10 more minutes, the number climbing well past what most People in that room expected the land to be worth. Somewhere near the middle of it, Frank Delaney finally spoke up from his seat near the front, voice rough and unsteady. "Let the young man have it," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "He's earned more right to that land than anyone else sitting here." The room went quiet at that. The developer's associate turned to look at Frank like he'd lost his mind, but nobody argued. The bidding slowed after that. One more exchange, then silence. The auctioneer raised his gavel. The room went dead silent, because this had nothing to do with money. This was closing a chapter that started with a widow's tears in an office doorway and a boy nobody believed was worth anything. The gavel dropped. "Sold to the gentleman in the back." The entire room erupted into whispers, because everyone finally understood exactly what had just happened. The boy they used to call Trash Boy had just purchased the very factory that spent 20 years dumping garbage into his family's backyard. Frank Delaney didn't say a single word as Elijah walked past him toward the paperwork table. Their eyes met for just a moment. Elijah didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't say anything cruel or triumphant. He gave a small, respectful nod, the kind you'd give any stranger, and kept walking toward the future waiting for him, because he hadn't come there to humiliate an old man. He'd come to finish something that started when he was 8 years old, standing knee deep in someone else's garbage. News of the sale spread through the community within days. Local reporters showed up outside the old factory gates expecting a satisfying revenge story. Elijah gave them something different entirely. This was never about getting even with anybody, he told them, standing at the exact fence line where trucks used to dump scraps into his childhood backyard. This is about proving that what somebody else throws away doesn't decide what it's actually worth. It never did. One reporter asked him directly if he felt any satisfaction seeing Frank Delaney's company collapse. Elijah thought about it a long moment before answering. "I felt something," he admitted, "but it wasn't satisfaction. It was relief. Relief that my mother lived long enough to see this land turn into something good instead of something that hurt us." Renovations began within weeks. Elijah didn't demolish a single original structure. He transformed it piece by piece. The old dumping grounds became organized sorting yards for reclaimed materials sourced from across the entire region. Outdated, unsafe equipment got replaced with modern, environmentally responsible machinery. The very land that once symbolized 2 decades of neglect became the largest reclaimed wood manufacturing facility in the state. He hired locally first, giving priority to families who'd lived alongside that fence line for years, breathing the same dust his mother once fought so hard to complain about. Some of Frank Delaney's former employees applied for work under the new ownership, unsure if they'd even be considered. Elijah hired every single one who showed up honest and ready to work, including, eventually, Frank Delaney himself, who came in quietly one afternoon, hat literally in his hands, asking if there might be any position left for a man his age who still knew the property better than anyone alive. Elijah could have turned him away without a second thought. Nobody in that community would have blamed him. Instead, he offered him a steady position in facilities maintenance, regular hours, fair pay, a chance to work honestly on land he once ran so carelessly. Frank accepted without a word of argument. A few weeks into the job, a younger employee asked Frank, half joking, how it felt taking orders from the kid everyone used to call Trash Boy. Frank thought about it a long moment before answering. "Feels like justice," he said quietly. "The kind that doesn't need to be cruel to still be real." One afternoon, months into the new job, Frank found Elijah alone in the old office, the same one where he'd once told a grieving widow to be grateful for anything at all. "I owe your mother an apology I can never actually give her enough of," Frank said, voice rough. "I said something to her once that I think about more than I'd like to admit. She's still around," Elijah said simply. "You could tell her yourself." A week later, Frank did exactly that, standing on Patricia's porch, hat in hand again, apologizing for words he'd carried guilt over for 2 decades. Patricia listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she simply said, "I forgave you a long time ago. Holding on to that would have only poisoned me, not you." Sometimes the loudest apology a person can give is simply showing up and doing the work. They should have valued all along, and sometimes forgiveness is the quietest kind of strength there is. On his first official morning as owner, Elijah walked the entire property alone before any staff arrived. He stopped at one specific stretch of fence in the back corner. Old, rusted through in places, slightly bent from decades of weather and neglect. The exact spot where his childhood backyard used to end and the dumping ground used to begin. Contractors had already asked whether they should remove that section during renovations. Elijah told them absolutely not. "Leave it standing," he said, "exactly as it is, rust and all." Some people mark their success with glass towers and marble lobbies. Elijah marked his with a rusted chain-link fence that most people would have called worthless garbage a long time ago, because that fence was never really a barrier holding him back. It was where everything actually began. His mother visited the property a few weeks into the renovation, standing beside her son at that same fence line, looking out over what used to be a mountain of splinters and broken pallets. "You remember that first stool?" she asked softly. "Missing one leg. You fixed it right there, on our kitchen table." "I remember every splinter," Elijah said. "Look what you built starting from that." He didn't have a response for that. He just wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they stood there together a long while, watching the sun drop low over land that once tried its hardest to bury them both. A year later, Elijah opened a small woodworking program on-site for neighborhood kids, free of charge, using nothing but reclaimed scraps from the very yard that once buried his childhood. Every child who walked through those gates got the same first lesson he once had to teach himself alone with library books and a flashlight. That garbage is just raw material waiting for somebody patient enough to see it differently. He named the program after his father. The Marcus Carter Woodshop, right there on a small sign near the entrance, honoring a man who once told an 8-year-old boy not to rush the wood. On opening day of that program, Elijah stood in front of a dozen kids from Miller Road, holding up a plain, unremarkable scrap of wood pulled straight from the sorting yard. Outside, somebody threw this away, he told them. Somebody decided it wasn't worth keeping. "I want you to look at it for a minute before I tell you what I see." The kid stared at it, unsure what he meant. "I see a shelf," he said, "or a frame, or a leg for somebody's kitchen table. I see whatever you're patient enough to see in it." That's the only difference between garbage and material. Patience and a little bit of stubbornness. One small girl in the front row raised her hand and asked if he'd ever wanted to give up. He thought about the emergency room, the fire, the lone officer sliding papers back across a desk, the scholarship letter he turned down. Almost every year, he told her honestly, but almost never lasted longer than a night's sleep. Curtis, the same boy who once mocked him at the fence line as a kid, brought his own son to that program years later, quietly signing him up without ever mentioning the history between them. Elijah recognized the last name immediately, said nothing about the past, and simply welcomed the boy in like everyone else. Some wounds don't need to be spoken about to be healed. Sometimes showing up is the apology. Carter Reclaimed now runs entirely out of that former factory, employing well over 200 people across the region. On the 1-year anniversary of the sale, the company held an open house for the entire neighborhood, the first time in decades that families on Miller Road were invited past that fence line instead of being buried under whatever came over it. Long tables stretched across the old sorting yard, covered in food neighbors brought themselves. Kids who once refused to walk past the Carter house ran freely through a yard that used to be a mountain of splinters and broken pallets. Miss Odetta, now well into her 80s, sat in a chair of honor near the entrance, the same coffee can generosity that once rebuilt a burned workshop, now repaid 100 times over. In the pride on her face, Mr. Alvarez came too, retired from teaching, but still talking joinery with anyone who'd listen. Mr. Petrakis showed up with his grown children, proud to say he'd given the very first storefront shelf to the man everyone was there to celebrate. Even Curtis showed up, his own son trailing behind him, the two of them wandering past the workshop stations without a word about the past, because none was needed anymore. Patricia stood at the center of it all, watching her son shake hands and laugh with people who once crossed the street to avoid her family. A local reporter, the same one from the auction story, found her near the food tables and asked what she wanted people to understand about her son's story. She thought about it for a moment before answering. People love to talk about revenge, she said. But revenge was never the plan. The plan was just to keep going when everybody told us to be grateful for less. That's the whole story, if you want the truth of it. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the sun dropped low over the sorting yard, Elijah found himself alone again at that same rusted stretch of fence, just like he had on his very first morning as owner. He ran his hand along the cold metal, feeling the rust flake beneath his fingers, the same fence that once separated a grieving family from a mountain of somebody else's garbage. He thought about his father's voice, telling him not to rush the wood, to let it show him where it wanted to go. He thought about how long it had taken this particular piece of his life to finally settle into its shape. 20 years, one splinter, one broken stool, and one stubborn refusal to believe that what the world discarded had to stay discarded forever. He stood there a while longer, watching the last of the light fade over land that once tried to bury his family and instead became the foundation of everything they'd ever built. Every finished piece leaving that factory still carries a small engraved tag underneath. Simple, understated, easy to miss unless you're looking for it. Built from what others threw away. Because Elijah Carter never once forgot where he came from. He just refused, for the rest of his life, to let anyone convince him that where he came from was something to be ashamed of. The boy the whole neighborhood called Trash Boy became the man who built an empire out of everyone else's waste. Not through revenge, not through bitterness, through 20 years of patience, splinters, borrowed library books, and one broken stool. Nobody else on earth wanted. Sometimes the very thing the world throws away is exactly what someone else needed to build something nobody ever saw coming.